Good afternoon. Welcome to the Leesburg Public Library virtually. Tom Wilcox is here to present the Florida Seminole Wars. Take it away, Tom.
Well, welcome everyone. And this is a very interesting topic because I think this is showing a piece of Florida's past that very few people today know about. And I'm going to go mention something about all three wars. However, it was the war in the middle. That was the longest war. That was the most fierce, the most bloody war. And I think you're going to see the lion's share is going to be basically that. So let's just start. Yeah, I think so. Let me see if you can plug it in somewhere. On us for a moment, and we will get to it. Yes. Hang on for a sec. Yeah, I can get by on that. That's no problem. There we go. All right, we're ready to roll. Okay, does everything sound a little better now? Okay, so let us start here.
Your audio is not too good, Tom.
Okay, you know what? Say that again so Deb can hear that, because that's why we're using this. Let me see. Is that better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Anyway, this is where the war actually started. It was a decades-long campaign to subdue and remove the Seminoles, who were not native to Florida. They were not native tribes like the Tequesta or the Ocala, for which Ocala was named. And they actually lived further north, but white land expansion pushed them further and further down to Georgia. And basically, they were trying to have a separate nation and be at peace. And but this is some Seminoles taken in the early 20th century. In the late women and children are in native dress. As you see, the man is not. So it was a very transitional time for these people. And now this was a really big source of contention in the war, because the Seminoles welcomed escaped slaves from the Carolinas and Georgia into their ranks because they needed more fighting men. They were freely accepted into the tribe. They could marry, produce children. They had the same rights as any native warrior. And that's where we started having trouble, because once a slave escaped, it was not easy, but it was still possible for them to get to a safe area of Florida and meet up with the Seminoles and to join them. And this became a big issue with white plantation owners, because they didn't want a successful slave leaving. they wanted to keep them. They were worth valuable money for their labor potential. And so they kept petitioning the government to act, and eventually it did. But on the Seminole side, one of the reasons why they wanted these slaves is that these were a highly motivated fighting force. They had no love for their former white masters, nor any white man who would cross their path. They would do anything to remain free. And this is why the slave owners hated the Seminoles. It was simply boiled down to money. And this is a chart I found from 2016 that basically boils down that in 1840, $600 is equivalent to over $17,000 today. As I said, these were considered to be extremely valuable property, and that's why they needed to get to them. So, and another thing that caused the war is that, as you see, even though we were very sparsely settled, the population in Florida in, let's see, 1840 was 54,477 white people, and that was nearly 20,000 more than it had been 10 years earlier. That was basically a 56.5% increase. And as the white settlers came in and they started crowding the Seminoles, and this was a bomb waiting to go off. Now, this was it was episodic, but it was an extremely long war, and so the war that we're really basically covering lasted 1835 to 1842, and is considered by most modern historians to be the absolute most remorseless war against Native Americans ever done by this country. Now, the first war in 1817, General Andrew Jackson actually entered Spanish Florida. This was not, it had absolutely no land belonging to the United States in any way, shape, or form. And he actually chased members of the Creek Nation in Georgia and Florida, and he fought with them there. He even actually had put on court-martial and hanged two British civilians, which caused a major international incident. But what it actually resulted in the long run is that it totally convinced Spain that they could not hold this territory and that they should give it to the United States. But this was a negotiated thing. In return for all of Florida, we forgave $5 million of debt that the Spanish owed to the United States. So that's how basically we got Florida. And I once saw an article talking about Florida history from this early period, and it said that about Florida, saying that the United States got a gift it didn't know it wanted. It was Florida. And this is a typical thing, an article from the Alexandria Gazette in Virginia, and it's talking about the war. And they mentioned very familiar names. They mentioned General Jackson, and they mentioned General Gaines. And I guess you sort of surmised that Gaines is what Gainesville is named for. And this was sort of an interesting incident because both Jackson and Gaines combined forces of about 2,500 men against 1,500 Seminole warriors, and the pretext was that the Seminoles had killed 7 white men, and they wanted to, make judgment upon them, and they wanted them handed over to perpetrators. But the Seminoles responded that the white people, saying here in the article that our people had killed 10 of their tribe and demanded a balance to be given up to them as the only condition in which they would make peace. General Gaines made pro-quo negotiations and immediately started an operation against them. Now, that war, like I said, eventually ceased and Florida became a territory in 1821. General Jackson was actually our first territorial governor, and the capital then was in Jacksonville. And so some years later, because this problem never got solved, more and more whites were pouring in. They decided to try to have a meeting on Payne's Landing on the Ocklawaha River with the aim to negotiate. They were going to negotiate some sort of transfer, try and make this work. And that really didn't actually work because the idea was to negotiate with the Seminoles to move west, and they offered to bring several of the chiefs out there to make a judgment on whether the land would be worthy of removing the tribe. And what they did is that, it all fell apart because some of the chiefs did not want to join. Others, they wanted to resist. Others say that they couldn't understand the ambiguous language of the treaty, and others claimed that they had been coerced by the Americans to accept it. And we're on the verge of, an actual real war here, and this is the thing that started it. But before we get to that, this is a map I got from the Florida Archives, and as you see, it shows very familiar places. And what happened was these are the ceded lands that the Seminoles gave up to the state of Florida. And it actually turned out to be nearly 9 million acres between Florida and Alabama and Mississippi. So this was a huge amount of land that was given up. Now, here's where the Second War begins, and you probably all know about that because we're very close to the Dade battlefield in Sumter County. And basically, a little over 100 troops heading from Fort Brooke, which is now Tampa, to Fort King, which is Ocala. They were ambushed by the Seminoles near Bushnell. And now, what they do is that they stage a recreation of this battle every year. Of course, they didn't do it last year, but every January they do it. And so basically, the 110 troops were set upon by 180 Seminole warriors. And, only 3 were reported to have escaped. And one of them, Private Edward DeCourcy, was pursued by Seminole Indians on horseback and killed. And another Private Ransom Clark, he escaped and got to Fort Brooke. He has the only account of the attack by a U.S. soldier. The third soldier was a Louis Pacheco. And this is sort of interesting because Pacheco was a slave, because that's what plantation owners did. In fact, even our White House in Washington was built by slaves who were hired out by their masters to help build it. And so they literally blamed him for deliberately leading them into an attack because he was part Seminole blood. But the thing is that the logic didn't hold up there, because being a Seminole who in any fashion and working with the whites, with the U.S. Army, was literally a death sentence. So it didn't hold up, but this is where it happened. And like I said, this is a modern day recreation of the attack. And actually you can still see part of the Army's route of march. And this is the Fort King Military Road near the Hillsborough River, and it's near Thanatasassa. So you can actually go there, you can actually see it. These are where these men marched on their way to Ocala. And this was a contemporary diary, and it says here, it said 21 Saturday, heard that Major Day's command was cut off attempting to march from Tampa to Fort King. So it was all, I mean, people knew very, very quickly when this had happened. And this is a contemporary illustration of discovering the remains at the scene of the massacre. And it's funny, it's been called into question. Some people in my resources said that the uniforms are not correct to the period. And what was the most especially erroneous was that the bodies were retrieved 6 weeks after the massacre, which occurred in the winter. And so they were not skeletons. In fact, one soldier recorded that the uniforms were totally intact. Now, this is one that you probably don't actually know about but I knew about it because I lived in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale, and I worked only about 2 blocks away from Cooley's Landing, and where you could cross the New River from the north to the south. And the men were trapped on the north side of the New River because that's who they were looking for. They were looking for Seminoles. And in the meantime, Mrs. Cooley, her children, and their schoolmaster were
Excuse me, Tom?
attacked. Yeah.
The technology of what you're using is inadequate, and I'm only hearing less than half of what you're saying.
Oh boy.
Your volume keeps going down. It is fuzzy.
White settlement. Yeah, most white settlement, like for instance, in 1840, there was no Orlando and there was no even Miami yet. So it was really Jacksonville was there, Pensacola was there. So it was really North Florida that was the center of population in the 1830s, 1840s. But like I said, the war did spread, and this was the second incident that caused the U.S. government to act. The Cooley family were massacred. They were on the south side of the New River in present-day Fort Lauderdale. The men, including Mr. Cooley, were on the north side of the river. There were no bridges. They couldn't get there in time. And what happened is that this was a fledgling settlement that was stopped dead in its tracks. Whoever was still there actually moved 25 miles further south to be near the county seat, which at that time was Monroe. All of this was Monroe County. So they wanted to be 25 miles closer to Key West. And there was, even though the U.S. Army built a fort there in 1839, they didn't occupy it for very long. That's how Fort Lauderdale was named. It was named for a Major William Lauderdale, who had to command, who built the fort. People were not coming back. They were so terrorized. And what they did is that present day Fort Lauderdale didn't really start as an actual entity until the 1880s. So that, that was totally gone. Nobody was going to move back there. Even Mr. Cooley moved to Hillsborough County and died there in 1863. Nobody was going back. That's how terrorized they were. So let's move on. Okay, now I want to point out, we have this great set here in the library in the genealogy section. It's genealogy reference, and it's actually papers. It's called the Territorial Papers of the United States. And everything that happened here in Florida involving the U.S. government and Florida between 1821 and 1845, when we became a state, is in these books. It's a multi-volume set. And I found out a lot of things. And this is a typical page. And then this is a letter from the Secretary of War in 1836 that assigned General Winfield Scott They were going to ensure the Native American removal, and also Commander Dallas, and I think you know which city was named for him, was to reoccupy Key West. As I pointed out, it was the county seat and the major center of population at that time in South Florida. Okay, and these are Generals Gaines and Scott. These are the major generals involved in the war. And even another future president, Zachary Taylor, was also a general in this war. And it's really a great, like I said, I got these from various sources, like the Florida Memory has some really good things on the war. And if you ever want to see the territorial papers, they're right on the second floor of the library, and they are invaluable. One of the things I found out, they had the chilling report that every single bridge between Tampa and Ocala had been burned by the Seminoles. So this was a really tough, nihilistic war. And basically, this shows you the map of, these are all the major battles. And you perhaps have wondered why Florida has so many forts: Fort Lauderdale, Fort Pierce, Fort this, Fort that. That's because there were so many battles. And this part is basically showing the Seminole Reservation right here in the middle in 1827, and then shows you how it got reduced and moved further south by 1842. Now, one of the major battles in this area was Camp Izard, and it was another massacre type situation. They were seized upon by the Seminoles, and they built these hastily built earthworks, as you can see here, and sort of built sort of almost like a triangle. And so they were trying to hold out, and the only reason why they managed to hold out was that an emergency force from Fort King came to rescue them. And Camp Izard was in Marion County, present-day Marion County. And this is actually on the right side, a picture of the layout of that hastily built fort. And they named it Izard for a lieutenant. He was shot in the head with a lead ball and died 5 days later. And this is something they found actually very recently. This was a U.S. Army boot that was on the site of Camp Izard, and it was almost perfectly preserved in the mud. So I thought that was really quite remarkable to find that in this day and age. And this is actually an article about the war, and from a Lynchburg, Virginia newspaper. And I'll tell you the backstory of this. This was actually the same page that had my Revolutionary War ancestors' obituary. And this was on, his was on the right side of the page. I didn't need that. I got this from the left side. And it says here, Florida, we have nothing new from the seat of war except that General Scott had arrived at Fort Drane, and we'll cover that in a minute, preparing to make the Indians comply with the treaty which they made with General Gaines, the terms of which are said to be that the hostile chiefs with their forces should retire beyond the Withlacoochee and there remain peaceably until the wishes of the government be made known. And it says here as an afterthought, Lieutenant Izard, lately wounded, was dead. And this is a map showing where all the things are. Fort King is Ocala here. As you can see, Fort Drane is a little further up. And, you know, they just don't exist anymore, just on a bunch of old maps. Now, these are some of the Seminole figures of resistance. The one we know because everything in Florida is named after him is Osceola. And he was a trusted advisor to Micanopy. And he was considered a really tough guy to beat. And he was actually, it shows you the extreme lengths the army went to. They actually took hold of him under a flag of truce, which was something you were never ever supposed to do in 1837. And they took him to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina near Charleston, and he died in 1838. And believe it or not, we actually have a remnant of that. We have his death mask. And it was actually made by the camp doctor the day after his death. And somehow it wound up in the collection of the New York Historical Society. I couldn't find out exactly why, but this is my take on the situation. The doctor probably kept it as a memento, and it got passed down through his family, and eventually somebody donated it because they lived in New York to the Historical Society. And so it's there. Now here's a picture of Micanopy. He was the lead chief. Osceola and everybody actually worked for him, basically. And he actually refused to sign the Payne's Landing Treaty, and he joined Osceola. And they were the two most determined fighters in this war, but there were quite a few others going. And now they were so effective that as warriors, because it was native terrain to them. They knew where to hide, where and when to attack, and they did so in a series of guerrilla type things, and they disrupted supply lines, and they just made things as difficult as possible. And they also burned down.
Did they have rifles, Tom? Did they have rifles?
Yeah, I mean, it was against the law to sell guns to Indians, but you know, that doesn't mean it wasn't done. And also sometimes they got them from the U.S. government itself as part of a treaty. Sometimes if they had hostages, white hostages, guns would be given as part of the changeover so that these people would be released. So yeah, it was possible. And so anyway, let's see what. Oh yeah, just to show you how good the Seminoles were, the U.S. government committed 3 generals and 30,000 troops, which was basically our entire army, to subduing these people and eliminating them as a fighting force in Florida. And a modern day historian estimated that it cost the U.S. Army 1 soldier for every 2 Seminole lives lost. So as I said, it was a very nihilistic war. And like I said, they had the home court advantage. They knew exactly where they were, which is probably more than most of the U.S. Army did, having been bought from all over the United States, as far north as Maine. And you know, they could hide, slip in and out, and just disappear. Now this is interesting. We actually have a set of private bills that were introduced by individual congresspeople on behalf of their constituents. And this was to represent a plantation owner here in Florida. He lived in the city of St. Augustine, and he's asking for remuneration for 320 head of cattle taken from him by the Indians in the war. And this was a really good strategy on behalf of the Seminoles, because by taking the cattle, they denied the army of beef. They made the very uncertain supply line from the north not be as effective because it got pushed. It had more strain trying to supply because they couldn't actually live off the land. And also, it was a great propaganda way to get rid of the white planters because by saying that, by attacking plantations, burning down buildings, stealing all the cattle, they really made Florida much less of an investment or a good place to live. And I'm sure some people left because of that. Now, in this case, I actually found, it took a while to find this, but basically, cattle was selling for about $70 a head back in those days. And that would be over $1,500 today. And if you multiply that by 322, basically this man lost 22,000 then and 500,000 today. Now, you know, the United States committed $20 million to this war. That exceeded the Louisiana Purchase that bought the spot where 13 states now exist, which basically cost the U.S. government $15 million. And this was an all or nothing war. The U.S. Army was here to stay and to win. And part of the way to facilitate that was the Armed Occupation Act. And this picture is of the old House of Representatives, which is still there. If you go to Washington, it is now Statuary Hall. And I imagine you've probably heard that because some statues donated by states in the past of Confederate leaders are being removed and relocated. So this is what they passed in 1842. It was the Armed Occupation Act, and it was a way to encourage people to move down there and also provide a homegrown militia that they, in case the Seminoles attacked again. And basically, you could get 160 acres of land, and it was open to any man or family head 18 and over. So basically, women could also claim that, you know, widows generally, and they'd have to develop 5 acres, and they would have to live there for about 5 consecutive years. So they did 5 acres and did 5 consecutive years. Then it was all theirs. And it proved very effective. It brought in a lot of people. In fact, even my family, because the holders came here in 1852, only 10 years after this legislation was passed. So they were beneficiaries of it too. Now, this was a bitter war of attrition. And, overall, yeah.
Let me ask you.
Yeah.
We're looking at history through the eyes of the Americans. I don't understand why these Americans wanted to rid the Indians when it was it was their land.
Oh yeah, there were a lot of complex things. For instance, the Indians, the Seminoles and other tribes had a whole different concept of how land would be used. There is a series on Starz called Outlander, and part of it is set in colonial North Carolina, and some people were actually started a war with the Indians because the farmer objected to Indians, the native people, stopping to use the water running through his property. He considered it was his water. and things escalated where the family got massacred because they killed a woman who was a chief and a healer, and
Oh,
there had to be a response. And also back then, most white people didn't consider Native Americans to be people. And that, of course, made it easier. It's much easier when you make a them so you can be more of an us. And also, another thing was manifest destiny. From the very first, this country believed that in order to be a viable country, to be a powerful country, it had to exist from coast to coast. And that was one of the reasons why Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Purchase, because basically all they were there in Paris was to negotiate water rights on the Mississippi to get back and forth to
mhm.
and the French suddenly said, well, we'll sell you even more than that. They just jumped on it. Jefferson didn't even inform Congress. He actually just gave them the money. So there were a lot of complex things of why this all happened. I mean,
Okay.
people than me can explain this.
No,
But
that makes that, I understand that, Tom, and thank you for clarifying that, because it just seems ultimate arrogance to
mhm,
go to a land that is new to you
mhm,
and you kick out the native people, but that is a contemporary view also.
mhm.
And I'm inferring from what you said that that is how white people viewed it.
Oh yeah, and of course, you know, when you live in parts of the United States that where Native Americans were no longer a threat, like Massachusetts, it was much easier to be more generous about them. There were quite a few people in the 19th century who did not like the U.S.'s policy against Native Americans, but it took quite a lot more years before more American people got along with that. And that happens because at the same period of time, most people, including women, thought it was absolute poppycock that a woman could vote, and see what happened.
Yeah, different times.
Yep, different times,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Okay.
let's keep
Thank
going.
you.
Okay, now, you know, eventually, you know, the US government prevailed. Too many Seminoles got killed. And what was left, this is, we're moved west. And this is a map on the right side of the page, basically showing you, and they show different tribes like in Illinois, the Saxon, the Foxes, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Cherokees, and way down here you see this arrow where they were all moved to Indian Territory, which is today's state of Oklahoma. And this shows you more clearly how they had it on the left side. This is the Cherokee. This is where they lived. This is where they could hunt. The Creek and Seminoles had to share land in the middle, the Chickasaw and Choctaw. And actually, this was also broken because in 1889, the US government actually allowed white settlers. That was the Oklahoma land rush. They fired off a cannon one day in the middle of June, and everybody went hell for leather to claim a stake. And the Indians, the Native Americans, were left out in the cold once again. Uh, Now, I'm not going to spend any time on the last war because, as you can see, there were an estimated 300 Seminoles left. And those that were moved west to Oklahoma wound up just withdrawing into the Everglades, and where they thought nobody could find them. And it was largely successful. In fact, the United States didn't conclude a treaty with the tribe until 1963. And where I used to live in Fort Lauderdale, there was a school teacher named Ivy Stranahan, and she's considered to be the mother of Fort Lauderdale. And during her lifetime, she spent a lot of time on Seminole tribe welfare. And you can actually go see a museum down there. It's on the reservation. So you can find out an awful lot about what happened to them. And you could find out more in the Florida Memory, as I mentioned before. All you have to do is Google Florida Memory. And when you get into search, you could just put in Seminole tribe, Seminole War, and a whole bunch of stuff comes up. And now, as I said, there was a sea change in the late 20th century. It was legislation on the federal level and the state of Florida level to try and make some amends for what happened in the middle of the 19th. So, basically things were negotiated. And actually, one of the things, concessions that Seminole won from the state of Florida is to be a designated gambling site, hence the Hard Rock Cafe. And there are ways to remember it because, like I said, these are two different. On the left is the recreation of the Dade Massacre, and it's well worth going to. And on the right is a picture of Fort Cooper in Inverness, which is my town. And every March they hold what they call Fort Cooper Days. And so there's plenty of places to go in Ocala. They rebuilt Fort King. In Orange County, they have Fort Christmas. And they not only show you things about the war and the Seminoles, but also Florida pioneer life. And now there is an alternate view. If you go into the Seminole tribal website, they will tell you their explanation of this war and its aftermath. So it's definitely well worth reading for a more balanced appraisal. And there are some traces still left. This is the Addison Blockhouse. It's in Volusia County. It's all that's left. This was a cookhouse because people don't have to do this anymore, but back in the days when food was cooked over open fireplaces, southern plantations and southern farms realized it was probably not a good thing to have cooking in the house where everybody slept. So they were often separate. And if you go to Mount Vernon in Virginia, you'll see the old cookhouse was protected by a covered terrace so that everybody could bring food and not have it rained or snowed upon to get it to the dining room in the house. And of course, you have to get the plug for the Leesburg Public Library. We have a whole bunch of stuff in the catalog. Anything in the 975 Dewey area is all about Florida. And you'll find a lot of good books all about the war if you wanted to know more.
Tom?
Yeah.
You can't leave without telling everybody that Leesburg was started with two land grants that were given to people as a result of this end of the Second Seminole War.
Oh yeah, that's definitely
one
true.
Were north of the boulevard, and the other was what is now Palmore Park. So that's how that was in 1857.
Yeah, and right about the same time, my family, the Holders, my great-great-grandfather, he got what they called a military land warrant because he served in a Georgia militia against the Choctaws. And so the government actually gave him 160 acres of land in Columbia County, but he actually gave it back because he was already living here. He was actually in Alachua County. And so it seemed pointless to actually move. But like I said, there were all different ways for people to get here, the Armed Occupation Act. And that was a major piece of legislation because Lincoln used it for his Homestead Act in the 1860s to settle Nebraska and points further west. So, and just to top it off, I mean, lately, in about the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of clamor to have Native Americans removed from sports teams like the Cleveland Indians, but somehow the Seminole Nation and the FSU somehow seem to have reached an agreement on, and you can actually still see their mascot, Seminole Warrior, riding on horseback out onto the field. And one article I said that it may be the last Native American sports symbol left in the United States in the 21st century. And this is the end. There's a historical marker for the Seminole Trail of Tears telling you about it. And this is the seal of Florida. And actually, anecdotally, legend has it that the model was Osceola's wife, Chichota, which means morning dew. But there is sort of a bit of irony there, putting a Seminole in to represent a people who were brutally put down by, what eventually became the state of Florida. But that's history for you. But anyway, I just want to thank you all for
Tom, can I say something else?
Yeah.
I want Rochelle and anybody else to read this book, The End of the Myth, which the basic theme, we're reading that for the library's book reader circle book club. And it basically tells how the white people just took over most everything, the manifest destiny and all that stuff. So that's a good book to read. The End of the Myth. Thank you.
What's the title again?
Yeah, and thank you, Santa.
It's
Yeah,
called
Santa,
The
what's the
End,
title again,
other
please?
questions?
I'm sorry.
The
Santa?
End of the Myth. I'm sending it to everybody in chat.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And I also have a question that came in through chat, Tom.
Uh-huh.
2 questions. By the same person, by Eileen. General Gaines, is that where the city of Gainesville comes from, or was it named
Yeah.
after?
Yeah,
Mhm.
General Gaines. I mean, he loomed very large in Florida.
I also noticed Micanopy. Is that how you say it?
No,
Yeah.
Micanopy.
Micanopy.
Canopy, yeah.
And that was named after a chief.
No, it's a tree. Yeah, and actually, it shares a novel distinction because for over 250 years of Florida's European colonial past, there was absolutely no interior towns whatsoever. Everything was Jacksonville, Pensacola. Everything that existed was on the coast until Micanopy, and that was the first interior settlement in 1821.
One more question from Eileen, and then we have another question from Rochelle.
Uh-huh.
Eileen's question is, what is a death mask?
Oh, okay. A death mask, there's actually 2 kinds of masks. One is a life mask. And like Abraham Lincoln had one while president, they stuck straws into his nose and covered his whole face with plaster. And when it hardened, it was tapped to release him while he could still breathe.
Yeah.
And that was it. Well, a death mask was done by the same way. It's just that the subject was dead. And it was often used as a memorial, mostly to a person. So it's a little complex whether this was done out of respect for Osceola or as a war trophy. I mean, it's a little hard. It could have gone either way.
Can I ask the second part I thought of a question for that? Why did it end up in the New York Historical Society collection?
I couldn't find that. And my take is that the doctor who made the mask kept it, and it just was passed down to his family, who maybe the doctor came from New York, maybe his family, grandchildren went to New York, and that's who they gave it to.
Yeah.
They probably
Okay.
spent their winters here, Tom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any
Rochelle?
other questions?
Yeah. Tom, what was the resource you stated told the events from the perspective of the Seminoles?
Oh yeah, it's actually, if you go on the Seminole Nation Tribe's website, And, you know, the Seminole Nation headquarters are in South Florida in Broward County. And if you just type, I think it's SeminoleNation.org, if I remember correctly.
Okay, good, thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to stop sharing if there are no other questions, but thank you all. I really enjoyed doing this.
Thank you all for coming.
And everyone
Thank
have
you.
a great, you know, Independence Day weekend.
Absolutely fascinating.